Welcome to our podcast. Today we will be discussing the different versions of the Bible. Mr. Jordan, Pim, will be taking lead. I, Ruan, will be taking the backseat today and discussing it with him. But he'll be taking point, asking the big questions. And yes, Jordan, take front.
Yeah, I'll be asking the questions, but you'll be answering them. Anyway, so I think just some context on the topic. As we've been doing a couple of biblical topics, been studying the Bible, and then it hit me. I was like, what is my actual approach to studying the Bible? I don't have one. I've just been going at it. However, I've always gone at it. And that is the way that I was brought up to do it. So I never really questioned how I did it. And so, hence this podcast, trying to understand the different translations of the Bible, what to consider when reading each one, and why are there so many, right? So, just for some context, and I think after I explain my own background, I would like to hear yours as well. I was brought up as I don't want to say King James only. There's a stigma behind it, but I would say that's pretty accurate description. So I kind of have this like nagging idea deep within me that it's the closest true translation, and other translations aren't really getting it right. So that's how I came into this. How did you come into this?
So for me, I was raised Afrikaans, and I think that'll give some good context as well about the different translation languages, the impact that has. But I think for me, it was always read the oldest Afrikaans version. And I could not understand that high Afrikaans because
Mm.
it's you don't speak that anymore. And then we'd go from the 53 to the 83 vertaling, and then there was recently the 2020, and I was always like, you know, I sometimes struggle to understand it in the one, but then when I read a different one, it makes sense, or it makes more sense. And then I was introduced to reading the Bible in English. And since I went to school in English, I understood it so much more. So then I kind of switched over to English completely, and I realized still sometimes when something doesn't make quite sense, I would jump between a whole bunch of versions to try and find that which makes the most sense. But the danger there is that you can kind of look for the interpretation that you want, because they're not always saying the exact same thing, even though sometimes they try to give the same message. The wording's different, and for us being so technical, that can have quite the impact. Yeah, that's how I kind of got into that.
And now with, sorry, giving you another question here. With now going into the English, what was your initial impression of the different versions? Did they appear to you to be more accurate, like the King James being the one that everyone says, oh, the High English one? Did that have an appearance of higher accuracy, or how did that present itself when you started reading it?
So when I first came across King James, I really thought it was Shakespearean kind of vibes. And I loved Shakespeare in school. So I was like, yeah, this is cool. But when I read it, it really felt like it was a story, and it didn't feel like it was history that I'm reading. So I tried actually avoiding the King James version from the start, because I didn't want to think of Christ as a fairy tale. I wanted to know him as what he was in the historical sense, and what the Bible teaches us about his life. So I always avoided the King James version. I moved to the NIV very quickly, and I liked how very direct, how very factually it was just saying what is to be said. I heard a lot of people say, stay away from the passion or the message, those where they try to focus on the feelings and the emotions, but focus more on the fact. And I've come across people that read those, and I've realized it's not necessarily that they are always wrong, but for me, as a technical researching the Bible, studying what is God trying to say here? How does God wish to be understood through what he is presenting in this parable? It's very important then to look at it very technically, and I've found the NIV the most valuable in that aspect. But I have compared a lot to the amplified version because sometimes it gives you those explanations which I found valuable sometimes and sometimes bothersome. So I jump around a lot. Does that answer the question for you?
Yeah, really what I wanted to get just the feel of there is, what is your impression once you read it, and how does that affect your relationship then to the Bible and to Christianity as a whole? Because I think it's interesting that you were brought up Afrikaans. Your home language really affects the way that you engage with the different translations. And it really is then difficult to say that there is a best translation, right? We haven't even gotten to the technical part of it, but I'm already just addressing this idea that, well, let's say there is a accurate version. If it's not accessible to me because of my level of English, is it really useful for me to read it? So very interesting point that I guess we'll go into, and very relevant to now, I would say, the way that your life panned out. But let's just start off by, so I'm not in theological studies or anything. I'm not an expert at all. This has just kind of been personal research, and to the extent that it's fulfilling to me so that I can continue doing what I want to do, or change what I want to do. And this is what I came across. I'll ask here and there for your input in terms of the timeline, make sure that I have it right. So I'm going to try and sum it up very short. Most translations of the Bible come from something called the Tyndale Bible, right? So there are previous translations to that, but I think it was like in the 1600s, William Tyndale translated the Bible into English. It was one of the first versions of the English Bible. It was apparently, so I can't really assess this based on my education level, very well written, very poetic. It's interesting you mentioned Shakespeare because it was around that time. So many people, even in the modern day, consider it to be a very well written translation. And it's interesting because a lot of the opinions that I saw from it from scholars are not saying it's a very good word for word, but it's a very good, still well written word for word. So, and the idea that I'm emphasizing there is, if I take, just our experience, any language, and you translate it word for word, it's actually a very bad translation. So we need to define what a good translation is here, because it's not just word for word. Anyway, the point being, the King James Bible contextually is a very good, poetic, well-written, engaging translation, especially for the language of the time, right? And that's basically mostly based on the Tyndale. And then from that King James comes RV, RSV, NK, the New King James Version, ASV, NASB. So there's a whole lot of versions that come from that. And then there's a couple of new ones that we experience today. And the reason I'm separating those is because we're dealing with two ideas. We're dealing with translations that are based on a previous translation, and then completely new translations based on the original Greek text, whatever, right? So all of those based on KJV, and then your other ones, your NEB, LB, new language translation, NIV, like we've mentioned. I'm just saying all these, I feel like I'm just saying acronyms now, but there's a couple of other ones. The Net Bible, the CSB, are all based on actual direct translations from the original text. So I'm going to take a pause there now and say, oh, what's the original text? What are we dealing with here? Let's get some history on that. Would you like to jump in there?
Yeah, sure. So, to my understanding, and I've said this wrong in multiple previous podcasts, so it's quite embarrassing, but the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, and the New Testament was originally written in Greek. So, yes, in that time they spoke Aramaic, but in that time the written language was Greek. So, we've mentioned this also likely in a previous podcast, and that could also affect some interpretations, because some people might say, okay, no, this isn't what he meant, because he heard it in Aramaic and wrote it in Greek, but he directly wrote it. I don't know it well enough to understand it completely, but I can understand that there's much confusion there. As taking it into my perspective, if someone speaks English and I have to write it down in Afrikaans, it's very often that there aren't the direct word to really capture, or actually it's more often if someone says in Afrikaans, there's not the English word that properly captures that feeling, because a lot of the times what you're saying in whatever language, it is close to that culture where only that culture has kind of created a word to really encapsulate what that meaning is. And I can imagine that happened a lot with the Aramaic and the Greek. So there's something that the Aramaic word can properly describe, but there was no Greek word for it. So then maybe you'd use multiple words to try and get that feeling. And now if someone's translating it from Greek word for word into English, you could lose that. And then if not properly understood, if you take that again from one type of English to a different type of English, because as we know, language evolves, and we see that for me in Afrikaans very, very clearly, hence why we moved from the 53 to the 83 to the 2020 version in Afrikaans, because that's the year 1953, 1983, 2020, when that Bible was written. And the language Afrikaans has quite dramatically evolved, and you can't understand the old versions anymore. So similarly, it can be very difficult to really understand what was meant and encapsulated by a word then and now. So, but I'm going off topic, but the fact remains, or the point what I'm trying to make is that's the original texts, and that's the answer to that question.
All right, so if I had to quickly summarize what you said, so I know that we're on the same page here. Old Testament, written in Hebrew. New Testament, written in Greek. But the spoken language in the New Testament, Aramaic.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something there about there's an argument to be made that because Aramaic was the spoken language and Greek was the written language, that there could already be a loss in translation there.
Well, that kind of goes to our previous podcast about, is the Bible directly from God? Would he allow that kind of misunderstanding translation to happen? I don't know, but I believe personally that the possibility exists, and that we should not be lost in a certain text verse, one verse, and be like, that's the be all and end all. You have to look at the scripture as a whole to ensure that there's no gap loss throughout the whole piece. So, yeah. But carry on.
Okay. All right. No, I'm happy with that. I actually don't mind that translation difference because it was, as I understand, the professional language spoken at the time. So people were all bilingual in that area. So they were all used to engaging with both languages. And I think the translation then between them, I want to say, was seamless. But that's just my opinion. Okay. But this gives us a background. Okay, so there's Greek text, right? There's Hebrew text, and then there's also some Aramaic text, and then there's also I want to mention this as well. There's a Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is called the Septuagint. I'm saying that wrong. Septuagint. Anyway, so these are the main sources that people use to do their translations. The sources that Tyndale used. But there's also something else which I think would be curious to mention, is something like the Dead Sea Scrolls and missing texts. Do you know about these?
No, do inform me.
Okay, I don't know about them either.
Oh.
But as I understand, these are like more recent findings of text around the same time. I'm not sure why they were excluded from the Bible. We'd have to look into that. But I did notice that for some translations, like the NIV, they decided to take these translations into account as well. Not necessarily include them in the Bible, but include them in trying to understand what would be the best way to translate certain text. So very interesting. I'll give a pebble there of what I mean by that. I thought it was very interesting. There's a small problem, I'll try and say this very fast, where in the New Testament, Jesus cast out demons, and everyone associates that with this messianic figure, right? Oh, he cast out demons, he must be the Messiah. But you can go and through the whole Testament, it doesn't anywhere specify or predict that the Messiah is supposed to cast out demons. There's no association with it. So how did the people in the New Testament know that the Messiah was supposed to do this and immediately associate it with this messianic figure? And the answer is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where there are examples of psalms that I think, I'm not sure if it was Saul that wrote them, that actually kind of prescribe that identity to the Messiah. And so it's clear that there was sort of an identity of casting out linked to God, and that's how you knew. But just an idea of how it can contribute to translation, but not necessarily be included as a translation point. Okay. But just the nugget, you look like you want to mention something there.
Yeah, I think the Pharisees might disagree with you. I think they'd say, if you're casting out demons, that would mean you're the Lord of demons because they listen to you. And I believe that's actually one of the things they try to use against Jesus when he was doing that. So maybe that, that knowledge of the Dead Sea Scrolls that can have this impact wasn't known back then. So that kind of makes us wonder if it wasn't even known back then and it's discovered all of a sudden now. How much should it, or is it applicable?
Okay, well,
that's a whole other.
It's a good point. That's a good point, but kind of, I was just trying to make a micro point of how it can be used to aid in translation.
I get you.
So anyway, so most of what I got about the different translations in terms of their applicability was from a guy called Dan Wallace. He contributed to many translations and stuff. I really liked the way he spoke about the Bible, so I really like his opinions and I agree with him. So a lot of what I'm saying is repeating him. Credit where credit is due. So he says this, and I really do agree with him. The best translation of the Bible depends on what you want from the Bible, right? We kind of mentioned that at the beginning. So what are you doing when you're reading the Bible, really? So if you in the morning, let's say, and you just want to open the Bible to perhaps engage with the Bible and read it and just see, you're reading the Gospels and you just want to get that feel, then you'd think you want a different translation than one that is so structured word for word. So I'm not sure if did we break down the thought for thought, word for word already?
So we have not gone there yet, no.
Yeah, so I think I'll go into that first. He breaks down translations into what's the word he uses for it? Objectives. So he says you can categorize translations by the objective of the translation, and those are, like now I've mentioned, thought for thought, which is, this is what they're trying to get across, this is the feeling, so let's try and recreate that. Word for word, which speaks for itself. And then the last one is like just readability, or like a dynamic version of that, where you're trying to be as accurate as possible, but you need to still make it flow, make it read, so that the person can engage with it in their language and it still makes sense to them. Right. That sounds a bit like thought for thought, but no, it's still trying to be accurate as much as possible, word for word, but still focusing on readability. So those are the three categories, and you can kind of fit each of the translations into those categories, and then based on their personal professional experience, give a best version for each category. And there's a reason that this is important, and I'll get to that. Or let me pause there and ask you, how would you categorize some of the ones that you've read into the different categories that we've mentioned now? Thought for thought, word for word, and then just dynamic readability.
So I think for this explanation, there's this image I found on Google, and I'll put it up on screen so that the people that I can follow what I'm saying whilst I'm saying it. So you guys will see, maybe you use this as well, Jordan, because it's very good in terms of summarizing how the original Tyndale Bible in 1525 started, and how all the Bibles came from that, and then which Bibles came from the Greek New Testament text. And then you can see basically the thought for thought translations all the way to your right, and all the word for word translations all the way to your left. You'll see noticeably that the original Bibles, most of them, including the King James or should I say the older Bibles, were all focused on being thought for thought. And I think as time went on, people realized possibly, I think, that thought for thought might be a bit better or might be more clear in getting certain messages across. But there are still very recent word for word Bibles. But the Bible I read, NIV, I see that's quite far to the right in terms of thought for thought. Sometimes I look at the New Living Translation. That's also very thought for thought. That's interesting for me to learn. And then ESV, I also look at sometimes. Surprised to see that one is very word for word. I don't ever look at the New King James version. So that's, I guess, what you're for. You can help me with that one. And other than that, I don't see the Amplified or any of those Bibles that I look at, or any of the Afrikaans ones on this chart. But to me, I'm surprised to learn that I'm reading the thought for thought Bible when I'm doing my very technical analysis of what the word or what the scripture is saying about God. Because I always thought I'm looking at it as word for word as possible about the thought for thought text, which is quite interesting.
No, definitely. I think I was also kind of realized that I'd looked to the wrong places for the wrong things here. And that's what I'm excited to do now. It seems, based on a couple of people's academic opinion, but I was looking at a couple of other videos, a lot of what other people were saying, and different people have different opinions here. But to a lot of people, the NIV represents one of the most well done thought for thought translations currently on the market, if I can put it that way. Some people feel like it also depends on your level of English. I think ESV, which is interesting that you say is more of a thought word for word, but I don't know. When I read it, it doesn't feel that way too much. But it is interesting that was seemed to be the objective of it. But NIV, when I read it, feels nice to read. And I find it interesting now that I understand the objective was that it was nice to read. And I'm going to reflect what you say there, which is, I was also using it as like, no, but it says, you see the word here says he used wisdom, not using wisdom. And so try to make some sort of theological point there that, clearly we're supposed to do this because the word is saying it like this. And now realizing that it's a thought-based translation, I feel so stupid.
Yeah.
So 100% I agree with you there. But then the question is, I'm comfortable with using NIV, for instance, for just engaging with the Bible. But which one do you read when you're studying the Bible? And that's a difficult one to answer. And people have different opinions on this. So have you heard about the Net Bible?
The one on the internet. No, I haven't.
Yeah, but what? No, not. That's funny. So, wow, that's very funny. There's a Bible translation, I think it's relatively new, like 1995, called the Net Translation. Dan Wallace, the guy that I was reading about, was heavily involved in this, so he's probably biased when he gives his opinion that he says that is the best current word-to-word translation, but not because it's a good word-to-word translation. If you look at the Net Bible, I just have it open here on Google. It doesn't necessarily give the absolute translation that it says. It's like, if you look at the physical Bible, it has a translation, and then it has a whole lot of notes on the side about, okay, these are all the different interpretations. This is why we chose this interpretation. And these are, all the derivative words that are important to make this translation. Even calls the Bible the translator's Bible, because when other people are trying to make a translation, they go look at all the options and then, okay, we're trying to do a thought for thought here. So we'll go more for something that creates a feeling in the person that more represents the original text. So going forward now, it seems to be a good Bible to use for studying, like if you're going to go on a scripture by scripture. But that's now just someone's opinion. I like the way that they engage theologically, so I'm going to start doing that. But that's kind of a personal decision that you have to make. But I think the last kind of question that I want to go into is how important is this really? Like, really, how different if, let's say, you studied the NIV independently by yourself and I was on, like I said, the net now that I'm reading. How theologically different would we end up at the end of the day? What do you think? Like, 10 years on, completely separate. What do you think?
So I don't know what the future holds. I can't really say, but I think if you are so tied to that one word, I think you can sway quite a lot, and we see that everywhere in every single church, or every single second church you walk into will have a difference because of this word and that word, especially with when it comes to predestination. Because the word predestination is in the Bible, so it's got to be true. It can't get around the fact that that's what the word means. But I wonder if that was the best word to describe some other thing. I don't know. I haven't actually looked into that. So I really think that you can end up very far on different sides of the ocean if you look at one word and not the scripture as a whole. But I think if you truly look at everything holistically, then I think you'll end up next to each other. Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm actually not so sure about that. And I'd have to go and prove my point here. But I agree with you in saying if you do the true essence, right? If both of us capture the essence of what it means to be Christian, what it means to have a relationship with God, then yes, we should end up next to each other, right? But the case then becomes, do both of those translations, perhaps in isolation, provide the necessary framework for you to understand that that is the essence? And that's what I don't know. And then surrounding that, there's certain important things outside of the essence that could create, I would say, pretty big branches like baptism. If some translations say you do it when you're a child, and some say no, you need to understand it fully, or the interpretation guides you towards doing it that way, then it could really lead you in completely different directions in terms of, if baptism is so important and it really advances your spiritual growth, then doing it right is important. And if you don't do it right, there's a certain something or huge something that you're going to be missing out on. That's what I mean by when I say branch now, I realize I don't necessarily mean branch in terms of disagree, but you might end up here while they're still there, let's say in terms of spiritual growth. So that's something I do suspect, but it causes like a deep dive into the important aspects, perhaps, of first salvation, spiritual growth, essence of Christianity, to understand where could translations not articulate these things right. But to get those main points is very difficult. But I would say you need to get that main salvation thing right, and then also you need to get concepts like grace right. So there's this common idea, and I am highly corrected on this, I stand to be corrected, that in Catholicism there is a aspect of, to land up in the good place, heaven, it is a combination of God saving you, so your faith that he did what he did, and your good works, right? So it's like both of those come together. And I know on the more like Protestant side, it's just about believing, and what the true essence of what believing would be, and really growing your relationship. So that is quite a conflict, and I would almost venture a guess to say that they're so different that one of them might be wrong, because one of them is pointing to something that seems to defeat what I understand is the essence of Christianity. So what do you take from that example?
I do think you're stretching it a bit far in terms of what could go wrong purely through a translation difference, because that I don't think to that extent can go lost in translation. I do think, yes, are slight deviations, but to the extent of the impact it'll have on your salvation, I do not think, maybe this is wishful thinking, but I do not think that your salvation can be impaired by the translation that you read, because, and this is the big reason, the Bible is not what gets you there. It is the Bible that facilitates your relationship with God, who is the one who gets you there. And I do not believe that a slight difference in translation can steal that. I do understand what you're saying, though, that if one translation is making you think it's faith by or saved by faith and works, and the other one is just faith, saved by faith, then you could be kind of believing the wrong thing. But I don't believe that'll affect your salvation to the greater extent. You might be, practicing pointless things, but I don't think that'll affect your. Well, okay, I say that with a exception, and the exception is that if it is that you are seeking God first in your pursuit to God, that you'll be fine. But if your seeking to God is scripture first, then yes, I do think you can maybe fall short of what the meaning truly is and what God is truly trying to build with you in the relationship, and then maybe yes, you could miss the mark. But yeah, I know we all do. But you get I think you get what I'm trying to say there. If your focus is so on word for word what the scripture is saying, it's all about the scripture, then your scripture has become your God, and your relationship has become with the scripture and not with God. So I think if you always have the perspective that the scripture is purely facilitating your relationship with God, then it all should be fine. But yes, maybe I'm learning much more from my own words in this statement than anyone else here, but the scripture is a facilitator, and it shouldn't be the be all and end all. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point that you make there. It's so easy, even just in this debate, to lose sight of what's actually important and what it's all supposed to be about. And I do agree that if you seek God earnestly, then you shouldn't miss the mark. I think that was well said. And in that being said, though, I would almost say then at the end of this whole discussion, it's really your background will determine what version of the Bible you find accessible. And you shouldn't feel bad for keeping on reading that Bible because of what other people say, especially if it's facilitating your relationship with God. When it comes to deep theological studies, I think maybe do your due diligence when you decide on which Bible you're going to nitpick the words of, because then you need to understand this translation, this is the objective, so I can look at it this way. And that's really all that I appreciate about the conversation here is once you understand the context behind the translation, you can more earnestly engage with it and have peace about the level at which you're interrogating that piece of text. And then also I think when you arguing with other people, you can kind of get on the same plane because you're like, whoa, we're arguing here in different areas, and that's where our disagreement lies.
Yeah.
You have anything to say more? Otherwise, I think we can close it out.
Last thing I'd say, I actually wanted to say this earlier. When I sometimes read the original text, I think to answer that question posed maybe 10 minutes ago, where if you truly want to study the Bible, which version? I'd say the original version. If you really want to go technical analysis, study the Greek, study the Hebrew, and that's the safest way to not get lost in translation, right? But still, you can't escape the fact that it was said and then written down. And if you say a bunch of stuff and someone writes down what you wrote, I can never fully get to how you said it, the emotions and the way you were presenting it, right? So there will always be a little bit of something lost. It's just written words. It's not Christ himself speaking. So there is a limitation, but when you do study the Greek and the Hebrew, for me, I use this app called eSword, and I would see that it says King James Version, and then it would give the King James Version word and the Hebrew word next to it. And that was like, oh, okay, I have to read King James, the word, the nice poetic word next to the Hebrew word to understand what the English is. And I was quite bothered, why is it in this version? But now I've learned that, okay, the King James Version is a very word for word translation. So I don't have to worry too much about the fact that this is just the Greek word for this King James Version word. But this is the King James English version word of the Hebrew word. But then I realized, oh wait, no, it's not. It's the King James English version word of the Tyndale version, because it wasn't written directly from the original Hebrew, if I look at this graph correctly. And that's quite funny. So if I were to study the Hebrew version, I would probably put the ESV up to say word for word ESV word, because that's English in today's language I can understand, next to the Hebrew word, so I can kind of get the flow. And if I am concerned about the specific meaning of a specific English word and how that affects the context, such as what we spoke about in the podcast about, should women speak in the church, or is it wives speak, teach their husbands? So that like kind of thing, if you really want to know what the word is, then I would probably use the ESV. And that's something I learned here today in this podcast. So that's my takeaway. And that's my practical advice, because we said we'd give that.
So it's interesting that that's your practical advice. I would disagree with you. I don't want to do it that way. So to me, I like the King James because of the historical background that it has on the English language. And also a quick comment, the Tyndale Bible, they just ripped most of it and put it into the King James. So I almost feel like you can use them interchangeably, and that's why when you see the branch from the Tyndale, it usually comes King James and then branches off on some of the graphs. I'm not sure what this graph looks like that you have, but Dan Wallace said this. He said most of the idioms in our current English language, like if not like 90% of them, can be drawn back to the King James Version of the Bible. So in his words, every English person should have a King James copy of the Bible, just because of the significance that it's played on the language, and perhaps the significance that it can have on your language, but completely not on the topic, which is word for word translation. I hear why you want to use ESV. Really, you need to choose a word for word that resonates with you. But I want to cap all of this because I realized something. We almost arguing, I almost want to say preschool kids arguing about, what's the best math to use, when there's a whole deeper level, which is the Greek, right? That is what you're supposed to do if you really want to understand it truly. And so I do realize what we're doing here is kind of we don't know that right now, but what can we do with our current capacity? But I do feel like it still has practical value, because that's what most people's situations are.
Yeah.
And so really what also is interesting now about both of us is we've both just uncovered the reasons behind what we're going to do, and that has led us in slightly different paths because of our background and our experiences with the translations. And to me, that's perfectly fine, given that our reasons are perfectly, I would say, come from a good place, and they both in an earnest seeking for God, right? But just do your due diligence at least first. That's really the practical advice here. So 100% agree. And
Yeah. Well, I guess I should go study Greek. I think you and I, we both like to pretend that we're very serious about understanding the scriptures. And
but clearly,
if we are serious about it, well, let's be serious about it. So definitely something to pray about. But that's all from my side for this episode. Any last words from you?
Nope, I'm very happy. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys. I enjoyed my milk, and I hope you enjoy your day or night.